Welcome to our Italian meditators from Rome, and also to Father Vincent from China, who's joining us today, and I think any other blow-ins, any other new people? Anyway, so you're all very welcome. I hope for those of you with who don't speak English very well, I hope you will at least understand a little bit of what I'm talking about. I was once giving a talk actually in Malaysia, and there was a large church, and there was one particular group of people in the church I noticed was really paying attention to what I was saying, which is unusual. And they were very attentive, and every time I smiled, they smiled, and felt very close to that group. And then afterwards, I was taken over to see them, and I was told this was the Chinese-speaking group. So I said how much I had appreciated their sympathy, and I was then told they didn't speak any English at all. So, what I'd like to talk about, first of all, Sarah, thank you for a wonderful talk today. Hard act to follow, but we're delighted that you've got two more opportunities to develop your thinking. But everyone has given wonderful feedback, so thank you very much. What I'd like to talk about now are two aspects of monastic prayer that we find, I think, at the heart of the monastic tradition, and that will help us to understand the meaning of meditation as we understand it. It's a word, as the Abbot Primate suggested, that has many different interpretations. Meditation, contemplation has changed its meaning many times in the course of history. But these two words, or these two terms that I'd like to look at, are Opus Dei, referring to the phrase that St Benedict uses to describe the divine office, the vocal prayer of the monks, and Oratio Pura, which is a phrase he doesn't use, but that John Cassian uses, and which goes back to the desert tradition. But it's a phrase which is implicit in Cassian's teaching on prayer, and St. Benedict, of course, points to Cassian as the next stage in the monastic journey of prayer. Just a word about the Rule of St. Benedict, which was the dominant standard of monastic life in the Western Church. The Rule of St. Benedict is a short little work, about 13,000 words, written at the end of the 6th century, and it is probably the single work that has had more impact on the Western civilization, apart from the Bible, for all of that period, because out of the life that Benedict legislated for or wrote about came most of the great social institutions of the West, from hospitals to schools, even to the civil service. So the Rule of St. Benedict is largely the result of an editing work that he did on an earlier monastic rule called the Rule of the Master, but his editing was very creative and very significant. But there are significant original pieces in the Rule of Benedict, such as the prologue itself. It's saturated in the Bible, in the Fathers of the Church, knowledge of Cassian, and especially the wisdom books of the Bible. That's the Psalms and the Book of Wisdom and so on. The main characteristic of monastic life, which the rule generated, and which became such a powerful force in Western civilization for 1,000 years at least, could be summed up in the words ora et labora, pray and work. The life of the monk was intended to be a life balanced, integrated, so that it could become a life without distraction. The goal of the desert monks, which Benedict looks back to as the golden age, in a way, of monastic life. Those of you who know the rule will remember where he says, in the good old days, monks would never dream of drinking wine. They just don't drink wine. But today we cannot persuade monks not to drink wine. And so we will at least make sure that they don't drink too much. And then he says, we therefore make it a rule that they should drink no more than 1 hemina of wine a day. The problem is nobody really knows what a hemina means. And the point of this really is to show that Benedict's interpretation of the ancient sort of monastic tradition was to moderate it, to adapt it to circumstances, to the modern world as it was for him, but also at the same time to regulate for moderation. It's difficult to regulate for moderation because what is moderation? Moderation, the middle way, is precisely difficult to define because it is constantly the result of adaptation and discretion. And that's why he says discretion is the mother of virtue. So people think that the rule of Benedict is a collection of rules, plural, but actually it's a collection of exceptions to rules. And it's the way he handles the system of exceptions that creates an understanding of how any life, in fact, should be lived. If the goal of that life, as it was for the Desert Fathers, the early monks, is to pray without ceasing. That was the goal of the monastic life. And it was to come to a prayer without ceasing through the work of developing purity of heart. Cassian says in his conference on the goal of the monk, he says the ultimate goal is the kingdom of God. In that kingdom of God, we will be in this state of continuous prayer. But the immediate goal has to be something that we can work on day by day, immediately. And that, he says, is purity of heart, which means to become single-pointed. The pure of heart are those who can keep their attention focused and remain consistent and faithful. Set your mind on God's kingdom before everything else, and everything else will fall into place in due course, according to the Sermon on the Mount. So, prayer and work, pray and work. The work of the monastery, the work of the monk at the time of Benedict was primarily manual work. Monks, Benedictine monks, unlike Buddhist monks, are expected to live by the labor of their hands. And Buddhist monks are not allowed to work. They depend upon the generosity of the laity. Benedictine monks as a whole are supposed to work. That work could be manual work, working in the fields. It could be the work of artisans, producing goods. Today, things like chocolates, liqueurs, and scented soaps. And later, of course, it became intellectual work, the great contribution of monastic life to Western society. This work was balanced by Lexio, what he calls Lexio divina, the mental work of nourishing the mind through the discipline of reading for the benefit of the monk's soul. This was not reading for distraction, as you might read a magazine today, just to entertain yourself in the dentist's waiting room. nor was it for entertainment, just reading to see what the rich and famous are doing, or merely as an intellectual exercise in order to gain information and improve one's intellectual performance. The reading that Benedict requires of the monk is specifically designed to nourish the soul, and it is, in fact, part of the process of continuous prayer. So the work and the Lexio, the mental work and the physical work, are both integrated into this project of coming to continuous prayer. St. Paul refers to that in the first letter to the Thessalonians. So much so that for the early monks, even when the monk is asleep, he should be praying. The prayer is literally continuous. This understanding of the goal of the monk had a huge impact on the whole of Western society. It was a formula that affected the way education and culture and medicine and, as I say, most of the great institutions developed. And perhaps at the heart of this was the requirement that each monk should read. And that was quite a rare thing in the 6th century. But if the monk was supposed to read the Psalms and sing the Psalms, which we'll look at now, that's the Opus Dei, then of course he had to be able to read. The Opus Dei, St. Benedict says, is the sort of regulating principle of the monastic day. There are 8 periods of prayer, of community, liturgical, vocal prayer. You have the vigils in the morning, and you wake up before dawn, as in the Gospel stories in the Easter period, waiting for the risen Christ to appear. And then at Lauds, a little later after sunrise, we welcome Christ at dawn. And then we have the little hours in the middle of the morning, the midday, in the middle of the afternoon, and then Vespers in the early evening. So that the whole day is punctuated by these strong moments where we stop and pray communally. And even if the monk was traveling, St. Benedict has a chapter on when monks travel, they are required to keep keep their observance of these hours of prayer, these times of prayer. And then finally, Compline at the end of the day, when there is also a memento mori, a reflection on death, a remembering that just as each day ends, so eventually each life will end as well. So this is the cycle, and the Opus Dei, the work of God, is a cycle, continuous cycle, a wheel of prayer, constantly turning, in order to take us somewhere. Wheels are meant to turn, not just to spin in the middle of the air. Wheels touch the ground, they touch the ground of our lives, and both individually and in community. And for Benedict, this prayer journey takes place in community. We are on the road, we are on the way. Benedictine monasteries, of course, developed the art of Gregorian chant, of performing these hours of prayer to a very high degree, very beautifully. I'm sure in the shop here you'll see many CDs of Gregorian chant. Very, very beautiful, very powerful, probably not at all what St. Benedict would have been familiar with. It wasn't his intention that monasteries should become centers of Gregorian chant or centers of liturgical expertise. The purpose of the Opus Dei, that is what we should be thinking about in this context, in the context of this seminar. What was the purpose of punctuating the day with these strong moments of liturgical prayer, revolving around the recitation of the Psalms, of hymns, of canticles? It's very important for Benedict. He says, let nothing be put before the Opus Dei, the work of God. So if you're working in the fields, or you're writing a manuscript, or you're doing an email, or you're reading a book, you drop what you're doing when the bell goes, when the signal goes. And you go down to join the rest of the community for the time of prayer. That's a very important element, I think, of the Benedictine ethos. At our Benedictine Oblate community in London, in Meditatio House, where we pray together, and we integrate meditation, of course, with the office as well, which is what I'd like to come back to in a minute. And we have we have another kind of office, our international center, international office on the top floor of the house. So we have people working up there. We work during the morning, during the afternoon. And we make it a rule in the house that when it comes for the time of prayer, which is in the prayer room, the meditation room on the ground floor, everything else in the house stops. So there's the working in the kitchen. Whoever's working in the kitchen will stop what they're doing and join the prayer, and similarly the people working in the office upstairs. So it can be irritating, you know. Say, I'm just in the middle of something, I just got to make some phone calls. Well, Benedict is not an absolutist, but he would say this is a general rule. There can be exceptions to the rule, of course, you know, but don't make the exception the rule. The exception proves the rule, it doesn't become the rule. So that's the work of discretion and the work of attention. So clearly Benedict thinks that this work of God in the divine office, the liturgical hours, is a very important part of the life. He gives 12 chapters of the rule to describing how the Opus Dei should be structured, how the psalms, the hymns and the canticles and the readings should be organized. And he goes into a lot of detail, which psalms, how to divide the long psalms, and what psalms to say on in what seasons of the year, and so on. And then, at the end of this section of the 12 chapters on the Opus Dei, he says, however, if you can think of a better way of doing it, then do it your way. He's flexible. He's given an example of how it should be done. There are some monastics who, for good reasons, no doubt, would be a little fundamentalist about this, and they would say, well, we do it this way, because Benedict says it should be done this way. Well, you can do it his way, but he also says you can do it other ways as well. Especially after the Second Vatican Council, there was a recommendation that the prayer of the divine office should be extended to and made available and should be encouraged to be practiced by lay people in ordinary life. So many of you, I'm sure, some of you will do that. Our oblates, Benedictine oblates, take up some part of the divine office each day. But on the whole, it hasn't engaged, I think, the spirituality of modern people very strongly. Maybe because we haven't quite understood why it's there, why it's being done. There was a very legalistic attitude to the divine office, which was, you know, if you miss one of the offices, because you were traveling, or somebody came to see you, or you slept in late in the morning, then you made it up. You had to read it later. So there was a famous story of a missionary who did all the hours of the office every day, but he could only do it, late at night. About 11:30 at night, he would read the whole of the office for the day in one go. But that rather misses the point. The point is that not that you've broken the rule if you miss one of the hours, but that the purpose of the rhythm of the Opus Dei is to create a balance and to create the conditions for continuous prayer. That means prayer that isn't just endless, but is continuous. It's not that we are praying verbally, vocally, or mentally 24/7, but that we are releasing within us, through certain ways and certain intentions, we are releasing in us the prayer of the Spirit. It's only actually the prayer of the Spirit that can be continuous. So if we are to pray continuously, it's because we open our heart to that continuous prayer of the Spirit. St. Benedict says that all 150 psalms should be said each week. And I think the vast overwhelming majority of monasteries would adapt that now, so that it might be over a 4-week cycle or even longer. When monks speak or think about the divine office, there's often, and monks I mean monastics, men and women, there's often a focus upon quantity. And there's often a more or less explicit feeling of scrupulosity or of anxiety if you don't do all the psalms you're supposed to do, if the office isn't as long as we think it should be. And when I first went into monastic life, it was meditation that brought me into monastic life, and I've learned somewhat about the meaning of these different aspects of the forms of prayer as a result of meditation. When I first went into monastic life, I thought this was a little strange, this emphasis upon quantity. And certainly it can be very legalistic, and it can create a kind of spiritual materialism. You feel guilty if you haven't done all your psalms for the day, and you feel satisfied with yourself, a bit like a Pharisee, if you have done all your psalms for the day. And that's something very universal in human nature, and something that religion often stimulates. It's a kind of spiritual materialism and legalism. And I was very critical of that in my own mind when I first entered the monastery. I must say that over the years, I still think that kind of scrupulosity and fear and anxiety and guilt is misplaced, but I see the point. I do see a certain meaning in it. It does give a structure, and that is what Benedict is doing. I think he's not setting us up to be guilty or setting us up to be self-contentedly pharisaical, but he is offering us a structure, and structures have a certain measurable quantity about them. And there is a certain satisfaction, which is not pharisaical, in completing a task. And actually it was a young Buddhist friend of mine who I was going to see, I think it was Into Grand Silence with some years ago when the film came out. And we were waiting outside the cinema, and she had recently, well, she was very much into Tibetan Buddhist practices, and she said, I just have to go away for a few moments and say some prayers. So I asked her what she meant, and it was she was being trained in a very systematic way by her teacher, and part of her training was to recite a certain number of prayers every day. I don't know how many thousands, but a lot. Very similar to the way Catholics would have viewed the rosary in the past. How many rosaries have you said today? So, and I realized that if I had, if a Catholic had taken that attitude to the rosary, we would be quite critical of it. We would say that's a little obsessive. But Buddhism is cool, isn't it? So she was doing exactly the same thing in a different culture, in a different way, with different words, obviously. But the practice had the same intention. So I've become a little, maybe less observant, but I've become a little more tolerant of this this aspect of the office and of the structures of prayer. I think we need it. And I think it brings us to understand the meaning of discipline. A young woman, a Christian woman I was speaking to some time ago, told me how she came from a vaguely Christian background, but she had been feeling, she was a successful young businesswoman, she'd been feeling that her life was becoming too stressed and she was losing the joy of life and something was missing in her life. So she did a mindfulness course. And the mindfulness exercises that she was introduced to were very helpful to her. She said she began to enjoy cooking. She began to enjoy, making time to be with her friends. And she began to recover some of what we might call the contemplative joyfulness and peacefulness of life. And then she said, but I realized I needed something more. I needed to go deeper. And so she thought, well, maybe meditation is the next step. And then she thought, well, where do I go for meditation? So she went to Google, of course, the great guru of the digital age, and Google sent her to wccm.org. And so she came on a retreat, and it wasn't quite what she expected, but she felt that it was something that she could relate to, and she liked the idea of meditating twice a day, 20 to 30 minutes in the morning, 20 to 30 minutes in the evening. And I met her about 6 months or so later, and I asked her how she was getting on, and she said, it's great. I'm doing it every day now, virtually every day. She said, if I miss it, I feel that I missed it. I feel there's something missing in my life. She didn't say I felt guilty if I missed it, but if I miss it, I feel there's something missing. And she said, I'm so glad to have found a discipline. I'm so glad to have found a discipline. Now, the word discipline, like the word meditation or contemplation, is one of those words that changes its meaning periodically. And I think for many people, the word discipline is an unattractive word because it implies something that is imposed on you, forced on you by your parents or by your schoolmasters or by religious teachers. You're forced to do it. But that is not discipline, that's coercion or intimidation. Discipline is what St. Benedict is offering us in the Rule, a structure, a regular structure, and like all disciplines, all regular structures, it's very difficult to do on your own. We do it for a few days and then we get distracted, we lose motivation, we forget, we become undisciplined. So we need a structure. Call it the church. Call it a meditation group, call it a religious order, call it a monastery, depending on what it is you're doing and what kind of support you need. And why do we wear a habit? Why do we wear a Roman collar? Because these are outward forms or structures that we find more or less helpful. They're not ends in themselves, but they are structures with certain requirements attached to them that are meant to do. What are they meant to do? That's the question. What are they meant to do? Is the Opus Dei an end in itself? Is it there just to produce a well-run monastery where the monks always turn up on time for the office, or say the office when they're traveling? Is that the end product? Is that all we want from it? Well, not according, I think, to St. Benedict, for whom the goal of monastic life was the same as that of the desert, continuous prayer. St. Basil, St. Benedict's sort of equivalent in the Eastern Church, uses the phrase Opus Dei not to refer specifically, as Benedict does, to the liturgy of the hours, but it is used to refer to the whole of monastic life. Rather like what the Abbot Primate was saying, it's the whole of the monk's life, which is the life. So it's the same for all of us. But both St. Basil and Benedict agree that the monk should be eager for the work of God. It's something that should produce a positive inclination and motivation. It's something you want to do. And that's why, of course, Benedict has the period of the novitiate during which the novice and the elders in the monastery discern with him or her, do you truly seek God? Are you really excited by this project? This process of transformation that Sarah was talking about today, which is at the heart of prayer. Does it really turn you on? Is it really a priority for you? Is it something that makes you excited, even when it's difficult, even when it's discouraging, even when you fail? Is it still something that you feel eager about? And if it isn't, then you should go back to the workshop and see how the pieces have been put together, because there's probably something not working properly. In chapter 19 of the Rule, Benedict describes not just how you say the Psalms or when you say them, but he describes how you say them. He says that the presence of God is everywhere, whether you're working in the field, whether you're reading a book, or whether you're singing the Psalms. But in the Opus Dei, at the time of these of this vocal and communal prayer, we should be particularly mindful of the presence of God. And the way we sing the Psalms, for example, should be in such a way that the mind and the heart are in harmony. That the mind is in harmony with the voice. So the way you sing is in complete harmony with the mind. I was very struck by this idea recently by talking to 3 Muslim students who were in a class I was giving, and they had started to meditate in a secular way, or each in their own way. And after a few weeks, I was asking the students how they found the effects of meditation in their life. And these 3 Muslims, who were devout Muslims, which meant they also punctuated their day, although busy MBA students, they stopped 5 times a day to pray as the Quran demands of them. And they said to me, we find the meditation very good because it helps us pray better. It helped them to say the regular hours of the Muslim prayer more mindfully, because they said the Prophet tells us we should not do these prayers mechanically and unmindfully, just, ritualistically. We should be doing it mindfully. So this, I think, I think St. Benedict has this in mind. when he speaks about the divine office and all the structures of the monastic life that he describes. I was meeting last night with some students, well, maybe a bit older than students. They were artists at the American Academy here in Rome. And they're here on a sabbatical year or a scholarship year to work in their own field. It could be architecture, it could be drawing, it could be music. And it was really fascinating to meet these highly gifted, highly creative, slightly crazy young people who were given an opportunity to become totally obsessive about their particular way of seeing the world and describing it. And of course, they were in a kind of monastic setting, as I pointed out to them. They were living in this big building. They each had their little studio where they did their work. They all lived together. They ate meals together, and they shared what they were doing together. And they collaborated in a most creative and imaginative way. And they were full of joy. They were just so happy to have this opportunity to do their thing and to discover new aspects of their passion. And one of them was a young artist, actually she was Italian, from Venice, who she said, she was describing to us how she had been interested by the beautiful churches in Venice. And she said, of course, this is a Catholic country. I'm not a Catholic. I was not brought up as a Catholic. She said, but I used to go into these churches because they were so beautiful. And then I looked at these beautiful things that they had in the church. And she's a design artist. And she was intrigued and fascinated by these things. So the things were, she didn't even know the name of some of them, I had to tell her. For example, the monstrance. You know what a monstrance is? The thing that you put the host in during adoration. Or the pyx, the little thing that you carry the host in when you go to see the sick. Or a thurible that you use to swing for the incense. So she had designed these most brilliant things as furniture, as design objects in homes. And she had some vague idea that the thurible, well, she knew the thurible was used for incense. But what she had designed was a very fascinating, beautiful version of that to be used in a home, to swing on a stand. And then she said something very interesting. She said, of course, in the past this was done for God. Something like that. It was kind of churchy. But now people can do this for themselves. They do it for what they feel they want to express. And I thought, this is it. This is the shift that has taken place from the time of Benedict to us. Maybe from the time of in the last 50 years or 60 years even. Now, this is the postmodern period. And she has no idea of that language. She never spoke that language. She never used those objects in a religious way. But she had an intuition about their use that she was translating into much more millennial generation kind of use. And I actually think it might be good to think about that extreme conversion of an ancient religious language and symbolism into modern design when we think about, say, the divine office in relationship to our spiritual life today. I think in a way, when you look at the spirituality of the desert monks, you meet a very postmodern kind of mentality. Their lives were lived with a radical simplicity and minimalism. They balanced the community and solitude. Their emphasis was on solitude, but they realized that solitude without community was dangerous. So they established a rhythm between living alone doing the inner journey alone and sharing it with others. And but when a young monk would go through a difficult crisis, he would come to his or her teacher and unload their problems and give vent to their feelings, whether it was anger or whether it was lust, whether it was sadness about what they had lost or left behind in the world, or their incomplete lives or their failures, whatever it was they needed to talk about, they talked about with their teacher. And he or she would listen sympathetically, with a loving heart, and then at the end would say, okay, now you've got to start again. So go back to your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. So there is this sort of elastic rhythm between community and connection and deep personal connection and the responsibility that we take for ourselves in solitude. Not dissimilar, in a way. A modern version of that, or postmodern version of that, might be the meditation group, where you come together in the group for the support, the encouragement, for some sharing once a week, and then you go back to your cell, to the cell of your life, however you're living it, and you continue the work with new energy. When those desert monks came together, this was before Benedict wrote his rule, when they came together, they sang the Psalms. I think they sang the Psalms essentially in the way that Benedict intended his monks living in community before they were strong enough to go into solitude, how he intended his monks to sing them as well. The person who gives us an insight into that is Evagrius, one of the great teachers of the Christian desert in the 4th, 5th century. He is famous for his teaching on pure prayer, on a prayer that is without images or concepts, a prayer of a radical simplicity, a radical poverty of spirit. He recognized that these periods of pure prayer might be quite short, periods of imageless prayer, where we are really free of thought, where the mind is as clear as the sky is in Rome today of clouds. But he recognized also that these short periods of imageless, concept-free, thought-free, pure prayer was a return to a radical simplicity. It was touching, as the Buddhists might say, and Evagrius is often well understood by Buddhists, touching the nature of mind, touching the depths of the soul, we might say. Never try to see any shape or form in your prayer, he says. For the Desert Fathers, prayer essentially meant this pure prayer that Evagrius describes. It takes consciousness to the limit of the mind. And that is what poverty of spirit means, to experience mind consciousness itself. In his 3 great works, Chapters on Prayer, Reflections, and on Thoughts, Evagrius describes this from different perspectives in very short little teachings or aphorisms. The pure prayer of the desert monks replaced, in their view, the temple sacrifice. It replaced all external forms of religion because it takes you to the essential sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of the heart, the sacrifice of attention, or worship in spirit and in truth, the worship that Jesus says the Father wants. It doesn't matter whether you worship on that mountain or on this mountain. The worship the Father wants is worship in spirit and in truth. And tomorrow, when I speak about Cassian's teaching, Cassian is the disciple of Evagrius and gives us a little bit more information about how to come to this pure prayer. We'll go into this a little bit more. But what I wanted to just end by saying was the teaching of Evagrius on pure prayer is not inconsistent with the singing of the Psalms. It's just that he approaches the psalmody when the monks came together from different parts of the desert. Periodically, they prayed the Psalms together, or they might even be doing their psalmody, singing the Psalms, or reciting them in their cell on their own. The essential reason that Evagrius understands for the singing of the Psalms is what he calls the healing of the passions. The word that the Buddhists, or indeed the Hindus, would understand to describe this would be chanting. When we had the first group of lay people living as oblates some years ago at Cockfosters, we just had meditation. And after a while, I thought it would be good if we did the office. It just seemed right. We needed a little bit more structure. And there was a big resistance among some of these guys and girls to the Psalms. Some of them just accepted it. Others really didn't like it. All this angry imagery, all these words, and the imagery of the Psalms can be quite shocking at times, and we don't want to do this. So I thought, well, this is an interesting moment. So I said, well, look, why don't you just do it for a month? I said, it's a very ancient tradition. Maybe we have forgotten what it's for, but let's try it and see if we can remember what it's about. And then, after about 3 weeks, after it had become a habit, probably if I'd said, no, okay, let's finish the Psalms, there'd have been another rebellion, because by this time it had been accepted, and you could feel that it was beneficial to the group. And we, of course, sang or recited the Psalms as a way of leading into meditation. And we had the half hour of meditation, followed by either the Benedictus or the Magnificat in the evening, or the Gospel at midday. So we had integrated meditation, the pure prayer, or the work of coming to pure prayer. We'd integrated that into this traditional format. Now, Benedict didn't do that, as far as we know. It does seem as if the desert monks had long periods of silence in between the Psalms, but they were living a very different life, less regulated by the clock than Benedict's monks were in the monastery. So this would represent a shift in the Benedictine order of doing things. Well, as I said earlier, Benedict welcomes change, maybe more than monks do. So we can come back to that maybe later in some discussion. But and this was, of course, John Main's approach to keep the traditional office, because I think he understood why it was there, but to build in this work of imageless prayer, pure prayer, meditation into it, so that they supported each other. Evagrius saw this when he said that psalmody, especially when it was undistracted psalmody, so when you sang the Psalms in the way that those Muslim students said the Quran, without distraction, mindfully, okay, we can then begin to see this as a mindful practice. If you speak about prayer or ways of prayer and use that language to a lot of the people on the streets of Rome or anywhere in the world, you will not make much connection with the vast majority of them. You speak about spiritual practices, they begin to show some interest. Well, they're essentially the same thing. And it's these forms of prayer, such as the office, the divine office, which we become very familiar with or over-familiar with, often forgetting why they came into existence, forget why they were there. We only get a tenth of the benefits, actually, they can bring us. So Evagrius, I think, had this very contemporary insight into the meaning of psalmody, the singing of psalms, as a healing of the passions, as a kind of therapy in which all creation and all human feelings can be recognized, noticed, understood. And I think when you get to know the psalms and you recite them regularly, there are some emotions or some thoughts or ideas which you just skip over because you're not familiar with them at that moment. But there are other times when you may be feeling very strongly one of those emotions. Could be anger, for example, against your enemy who's done you some harm. And this emotion of anger is expressed in the psalm. You notice it, it's expressed for you, and of course it helps to heal it or to regulate it. Evagrius, of course, understood that this coming together of the personal and the collective experience, or personal and collective history, happens in Christ. And he says the reason that the psalmody is therapeutic is because we meet Christ the physician. We meet Christ in this body of sacred writing. By the 4th century, psalms had become a principal tool of Christian prayer. In reciting or singing the psalms, the passions were calmed, and Evagrius says, the body's disharmony can be corrected. So he saw a physical effect of the chanting of the psalms. And that's no doubt why why a lot of monasteries make their living by producing CDs of Gregorian chant. It is very calming, not only to the mind, but also, as he says, correcting the body's disharmony. Because it is the humanity of Christ that we are connecting with through this exercise. We meet Christ the physician, Christ the healer. In particular, for Evagrius, he says it is the healing of thumos, which is a Greek word that it has different meanings. For the ancient Greeks, it meant sort of manliness, vigor. The sense in which Evagrius uses it in the ascetical tradition, it is when the mind is overexcited, when we get hot under the collar, especially with anger. We need thumos, we need this sort of energy to live and to live well, but it easily becomes overindulged or overactive. And it gets the singing of the psalms, according to Evagrius, as it were, takes it off the boil. He says popular songs, if you think of what you would listen to on the radio, on the car radio, arouse thumos, but psalmody cools it. So here I think is a very interesting and useful insight from the ancient monastic tradition into a form of prayer that Benedict recommends and made central to the life of the Church. We call the divine office, the Opus Dei now, we call it the prayer of the Church. All deacons and priests and, I don't know about religious, I can't remember, but anyway, certainly all priests and deacons and monks are supposed to say the office every day. So it's the prayer of at least the clerical church. So if we go back to these roots, we might get a better understanding of what is the essential purpose of this form of prayer. And I think what reveals the meaning and the purpose of it is a rediscovery of the prayer of the heart, of that pure prayer of meditation. Benedict doesn't speak specifically about meditation because he says this is just the first course. This is the first semester of the monastic life. And then you move on and you get into meditation. And that's why he points to Cassian. He does, on a few occasions, speak about the personal prayer of the monk. He speaks about the monk repeating certain verses in his heart as he goes about his daily life. He speaks about mindfulness at the time of prayer, so that the voice and the mind should be in harmony. And he says there are times when your prayer, your personal prayer, may be extended by the Holy Spirit, in which case the other monks should leave the chapel quietly. So that gives us a nice insight into the balance, I think, between organized and structured prayer in Benedict's community vision and personal prayer, and the flexibility he allows for that. I think beginning to understand it in this way makes a lot of sense of the other aspects of the ascetical monastic tradition. For example, the guarding of the heart, a necessary tool or practice if you want to grow in continuous prayer, to watch the thoughts of anger or other disordered states of mind that may arise, catching them as soon as they arise, for example. Balancing the work, reading, and prayer times of your life, while making sure that every day respects the need for wholeness that we have, which is reflected in those three dimensions of body, mind, and spirit. What I think this can also help us to see is that meditation does not replace other forms of prayer. When I've spoken often to individual monks about meditation, I hear very much the same reason for not doing it as I hear from people working in investment banks. I don't have time. I don't have time for it. And it's true, if your life is organized around certain events and commitments, then responsibilities, it may seem as if making more time available for meditation is going to be a big problem for you. But it only seems as if it is. It actually, of course, we know that meditation creates more time. It expands your sense and experience of time. And like everything else in life, it's a question of priority. What is really important to us? But meditation in itself does not threaten the other forms of prayer, such as the divine office. The Opus Dei is not threatened by oratio pura, quite the reverse. We will understand the meaning of the Opus Dei and the other forms of prayer, not least the Eucharist itself, much more clearly and richly when we have made time for the practice of meditation, of pure prayer. And the reason for this is, of course, that all forms of prayer, John Main says there are no methods of prayer, there's only the prayer of Christ, but all forms of prayer lead in the Christian understanding into the prayer of Christ, the prayer of the Spirit. Good.